The Mafia boss didn't expect his day to end in a trap, but the sound of the steel door slamming shut was a sound he knew all too well. It was heavy, final, and carried a weight that echoed through the empty room. He turned slowly, his hand reaching for a weapon he realized he didn't have. He looked for his guards, but the hallway was gone. He looked for an exit, but there were only solid walls. There was no noise, no shouting, and no footsteps. There was only silence. Then he saw them. 10 women stood in a perfect half circle, watching him like he was a prize they had finally caught. They weren't screaming, and they weren't afraid. They stood perfectly still, calm and smiling at him. It was the kind of look people give when they had been waiting for a very long time for a plan to finally work. The boss felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his face cold and focused. He was used to being the most dangerous person in the room, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't so sure. One of the women took a step toward him. She didn't look like a killer, but her eyes were sharp as glass. She spoke softly, her voice cutting through the quiet air. "You should not have come in here," she said. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. He turned back to the door, his mind racing for a way out. He grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked tight. In that heartbeat, the cold reality hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't broken into this room to be a hero. This was not a rescue mission, and there was no victim to save. He had walked directly into a masterfully planned trap. The most powerful man in the city was now a prisoner, and the game was just beginning.
Before the story takes a darker turn, I just want to say thank you to everyone supporting this channel. Your likes, your time, your presence here, it means everything. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be the perfect moment, because what's coming next, you don't want to miss it.
Just minutes earlier, the Mafia boss felt like he was on top of the world. He was walking through the quiet, luxury hotel hallway, his mind cold and focused on his next big deal. He was a man who noticed everything, but even he didn't see the setup coming. Suddenly, a sound shattered the quiet. It was a scream. The voice belonged to a woman, and it sounded absolutely terrified. It was the kind of desperate, breaking cry that makes a person's blood run cold. Without a second thought, the boss reacted with the instinct of a man used to action. He didn't call for his men. He didn't wait. He moved fast, his heavy boots smashing against the wood as he kicked the door open to save whoever was inside. He burst into the room expecting to find a fight. He expected to see a victim being attacked or a gunman waiting to fire. His muscles were tight, ready to take down anyone in his path. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, the world went upside down. The room wasn't a scene of chaos. It was too quiet, way too quiet. Everything was in its perfect place, looking exactly like a normal high-end hotel room. There was no struggle, no broken glass, and no sign of a fight. And the most chilling part? The moment his foot hit the floor inside that room, the scream stopped instantly. It didn't fade away or turn into a sob. It just vanished, as if someone had flipped a switch. He stood there in the center of the room, his chest heaving, realizing he had just chased a ghost. The silence wasn't a relief. It was a warning. He had run toward danger to be a protector, but he had actually just walked into his own cage. The Mafia boss stood in the center of the room, the silence pressing against his ears. Now he understood the truth. That blood-curdling scream was nothing but a fake signal to reel him in. But as he looked around, the tension didn't feel like a fight anymore. It felt like a hunt. The women didn't look like enemies. They looked like sirens. One woman with eyes like emeralds stepped into his personal space, the scent of her perfume filling his lungs. She didn't pull a knife. Instead, she let her fingers trail slowly down his arm, her touch light but electric. She tilted her head, a playful, dangerous smile on her lips. "You always run to save people," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "That is why you are here." She leaned in closer, her voice a low hum that vibrated in the small space. Another woman circled behind him, her hand resting firmly on his shoulder, her thumb stroking the base of his neck. "This is not a hotel room," she said, her voice soft but sharp as a razor. She leaned over his shoulder, her lips almost brushing his ear. "This is a test." The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with a different kind of heat. They weren't just trying to scare him, they were trying to melt his resolve, using their touch to find the heartbeat beneath his cold exterior. The Mafia boss did not move an inch. He felt their hands, heard their soft laughter, and smelled their trap. Most men would have melted or panicked under the weight of 10 beautiful women closing in, but he wasn't most men. Instead of breaking, a small, dark smile appeared on his face. He looked at the woman in front of him, his eyes boring into hers with a fire of his own. Because now, he didn't just want to escape. He wanted to know who was really in control of this seductive game. The air in the room didn't just feel heavy. It felt thick, like it was vibrating with a new kind of energy. The walls hadn't moved, but the atmosphere had shifted from a simple trap into a high-stakes psychological war. One of the women began to walk slowly around him, her movements fluid and intentional, like a predator studying a rare animal in a cage. She let her hand graze his chest as she passed, her eyes searching his for any flicker of fear or desire. "You are not scared," she noted, her voice dripping with a mix of curiosity and challenge. The Mafia boss remained perfectly still, a statue of ice in the middle of their heat. He didn't offer a single word in reply, knowing that in this game, silence was his strongest weapon. Another woman stepped forward, carrying a glass of water that caught the dim light of the room. She placed it on the table near him, her fingers lingering on the glass as she leaned in close. "Drink," she whispered, her eyes locked onto his. "Or don't, it changes nothing." Suddenly, the lights dimmed, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. A soft, melodic voice drifted from a dark corner of the room, sounding almost like a lullaby. "We don't need to hurt you," the voice said, promised with a hint of a hidden threat. "We just need to see when you break." They wanted to see him crumble, to see the powerful boss beg or lose his cool under their touch and their psychological pressure. But he didn't break, he didn't reach for the water, and he didn't look away from their intense stares. Instead, he simply let that dark, confident smile return to his lips. He watched as their confident expressions faltered for the first time. His refusal to play their part was making them uncomfortable, and the hunters were starting to realize that their prey wasn't acting like a victim at all. Something was very wrong, and the women could feel the change in the air. They had expected a certain reaction when they locked the door. They expected to see sweat on his forehead, a crack in his voice, or the frantic look of a trapped man. They expected panic, but the Mafia boss didn't give them the satisfaction of a single flinch. Instead, he did something that made the hair on their arms stand up. He started to walk. He didn't pace like a caged tiger. He walked slowly and deliberately toward the center of the room with a calm, heavy stride, looking like a man who owned the entire building. He stopped and turned his head, looking at each of the 10 women one by one, his gaze lingering long enough to make them feel exposed. Then he finally broke his silence, his voice quiet but echoing with power. "You think you caught me," he said, his eyes flashing with a cold amusement. He took a step closer to the woman who had been touching him earlier, watching her eyes widen just a fraction. "But I walked into this room on my own feet." A heavy silence hit the room, thicker and more suffocating than before. The flirtatious smiles on the women's faces began to fade. One woman frowned, her brow furrowing as she realized her plan was slipping through her fingers. This was definitely not part of the script they had practiced. Another woman leaned toward her friend and whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "He is not reacting like the others." For the first time since the door slammed shut, the confidence in the room didn't belong to the 10 women. It belonged to the man they thought they had trapped. A cold seed of doubt had officially entered the room. The test continued, but the energy in the room had turned sour. The women shifted their tactics, trying every trick in the book to snap his ironclad focus. They tried cutting remarks, long stretches of suffocating silence, and intense, unblinking stares meant to make him squirm. One woman leaned in, her jewelry clinking as she whispered a dark secret about his past, hoping to see a spark of anger. But the mafia boss remained a fortress. However, one woman in the group began watching him differently than the others. She wasn't looking at him like a target or an enemy to be defeated. She wasn't even acting like a tester anymore. Instead, she looked genuinely confused, her brow furrowed as she studied the man who refused to be broken. She saw something in his eyes, a depth of strength she hadn't been prepared for. Finally, she couldn't stay quiet any longer. "You don't belong here," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the humming of the air conditioner. The mafia boss turned his head and looked at her directly, his gaze so sharp it felt like he was reading her soul. "And yet I am still here," he replied, his voice smooth and steady. The simple truth of his words hit her harder than any physical blow could have. She was the one who was supposed to be in charge, yet she was the one who felt exposed. She looked away first, unable to hold his intense stare. It was a small moment, but everyone in the room felt the shift. That was the first crack. It wasn't a crack in his armor. It was a crack in theirs. The hunters were starting to realize they might be the ones in over their heads. The room was no longer under their control. The 10 women could feel the power slipping through their fingers like sand. The atmosphere had completely flipped. The mafia boss was no longer reacting like a man caught in a cage. He stood tall, his presence filling the space until the walls seemed to shrink around the women instead of him. He began to move again, but this time his eyes weren't just watching, they were analyzing. He was studying them now. He looked at the way one woman gripped her glass too tightly and how another kept glancing at the security camera in the corner. It was as if he was learning their deepest fears just by looking at them. One woman, feeling the pressure of his silence, stepped forward quickly. She was desperate to regain her authority. "This ends now," she snapped, her voice high and tight. "You fail the test." She expected him to argue or look disappointed, but the mafia boss only tilted his head to the side, looking at her with genuine curiosity. "What test?" he asked quietly. That simple question made her freeze in her tracks. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By asking that, he wasn't just being difficult, he was questioning their entire authority. He was refusing to even acknowledge that they had the right to judge him. In 2 words, he had turned their complex test into a joke. And for the first time, the women looked at each other with genuine uncertainty. The woman who had shown doubt earlier stepped back slowly, her confidence completely evaporated. The air in the room was cold, and for the first time, the hunters looked like they wanted to run. Her voice shook a little when she finally found the courage to speak. "We were told you would panic, or beg, or break." She looked at the floor, unable to meet his gaze, and added a final, devastating admission. "But you didn't." The mafia boss didn't stay in the center of the room anymore. He moved closer to them, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic like a heartbeat. He looked at the group, his presence overwhelming the small space. "And if I don't break?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it hung in the air like a death sentence. No one answered. The silence was deafening because there was no plan for this outcome. They had spent weeks, maybe months, preparing for his fear, but they hadn't spent a single second preparing for his strength. The room that once felt like a place of power and control now felt uncertain and small. Even the leader of the group, the woman who had first greeted him with such a smug smile, avoided his eyes now. She looked away, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. The secret was out. The test was over. But not because they had finished it. It was over because the subject had taken over the laboratory. And now the scientists were the ones trapped. The atmosphere in the room didn't just change. It transformed into something far more dangerous than a simple trap. One woman, the same one who was the first to doubt the mission, found herself unable to stop looking at him. She wasn't looking at him as a target anymore, but with a strange magnetic pull that terrified her. While the others were frozen in their own uncertainty, she moved toward him. She leaned in, her voice a low whisper that only he could hear, ensuring the others stayed in the dark. "You are dangerous, not because you fight," she breathed, her eyes searching his for a sign of humanity, "but because you don't lose control." For a long, heavy moment, their eyes locked. It was a gaze that felt like it lasted a lifetime. And that look, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't the warmth of trust, and it wasn't the cold sting of fear. It was something much deeper, an acknowledgement of power that shouldn't exist. The other women shifted uncomfortably, noticing the intense connection forming in the center of the room. The energy shifted again, turning sharp and jagged. This was no longer just a psychological test or a game of hide and seek. It was becoming an emotional war, and the lines between the hunter and the hunted were now completely blurred. The air in the room was electric, vibrating with a tension that felt like it might shatter the walls at any moment. The Mafia boss, calm as a predator who had already won, walked slowly toward the locked door. He didn't rush, and he didn't look back with fear. He simply placed his large, steady hand on the cold surface of the door, but he didn't push it open yet. Behind him, the silence was broken by a soft, trembling voice. "You can leave any time," one of the women said. The power had completely shifted. The cage was open, but the prisoner was the one in command. He turned his head just slightly, his profile sharp against the dim lights of the room. "I know," he replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the floorboards. A long, heavy pause followed, where the only sound was the synchronized breathing of 10 women who were no longer his captors. They were frozen, caught in the gravity of his presence. Then he delivered the final blow that changed everything. "But now I want to know who will stop me and who will follow me." The words hung in the air like a challenge and a promise all at once. No one moved. No one tried to block his path or argue. For the first time since he kicked that door open, they weren't testing his limits anymore. They were standing in the wreckage of their own plan, breathless and uncertain, simply waiting for his next move. He turned the handle, the lock clicking open with a sound that signaled the end of their game and the beginning of his reign. The value of this story lies in its masterclass on emotional intelligence and unshakable stoicism. While the 10 women try to use environment, seduction, and fear to break the Mafia boss, he remains the true person in control because he refuses to react to their provocation. This narrative teaches several key life lessons. The power of silence. By not explaining himself or reacting to the test, the boss forces his opponents to reveal their own insecurities. Frame control. He refuses to accept the role of a victim. Instead of playing their game, he questions their authority, effectively flipping the trap into his own recruitment ground. Internal strength versus external pressure. The story highlights that true power isn't about physical violence. It's about maintaining your composure when everyone expects you to panic. Ultimately, the story shows that when you don't lose control of yourself, you gain control over the room, even when the door is locked from the outside.